Welcome, I'm Tracy McFadden, the director of the Friends of the Morrill Homestead. And just a quick note for those of you joining us on Zoom, if you could please mute your computers for the entire program when we get to the question and answer section. If you could just type your questions into the chat, I will do my best to ask as many of them as I can. The Friends of the Morrill Homestead is a small nonprofit that supports the Justin Morrill State Historic Site, which is owned and operated by the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation. And we provide programs and care for the gardens and orchard with the help of volunteers. After the July 10th flooding, the homestead at first appeared to be unscathed, but it was discovered over a week later that there was significant flooding in the basement of the education center, and portions of the stream bank were failing. The water mitigation and stream restoration efforts may be quite extensive. So unfortunately, the site will remain closed for quite a while, possibly through the end of the season. And the rest of our programs at the homestead have been canceled, with the exception of the walking tour of Morrill Stratford Village next Saturday. There's a donation on the table in the back, and any donations to help replace what we lost in the flooding will be greatly appreciated. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Vermont Humanities for a generous grant that made this event possible, and EC Fiber for being a sponsor and providing internet access both at the homestead and here in the townhouse. Today's event is in commemoration of the 140th anniversary of Senator Morrill's gift of a library to the town of Stratford. Justin Morrill, the son of the town blacksmith, was born in 1810, the eldest son in a family of 10 children. Justin had to leave school at the age of 15. Unable to afford further schooling, Morrill turned to books for his education. At first borrowing books from Judge Jedediah Harris, his mentor and future business partner. Although Morrill's formal schooling was over, his thirst for learning was not. Harris possessed an excellent private library, which the young Morrill devoured. And for all his life, Morrill depended on books for his intellectual nourishment. As a testament to his passion for books, Morrill fiercely pushed through Congress the building of the Library of Congress on Capitol Hill. And later, in 1883, he built and endowed Stratford's first public library, the Harris Library, named in honor of his mentor, and built right between Judge Harris's home and store. In 1929, the Morrill Memorial and Harris Library was built as a memorial to Senator Justin Morrill per the will of his sister-in-law, Louise Swan. This new library was created to house the senator's personal collection of paintings and almost 2,000 books, along with the contents of the original Harris Library. I believe Morrill would be pleased to see what a vital part of our community the library is today. No longer a library, the building Morrill donated continued to be a community building and currently houses the town office. Today, there is a dedicated committee working to restore the building's historic attributes, while at the same time updating it to meet 21st century standards and the expanding needs of our town government. If you're curious about that endeavor, John Freitag is here to answer your questions. 140 years ago, in this very same building in which you are now sitting, Senator Morrill gave a speech on the presentation by him of the library building to the town of Stratford. The following are a collection of remarks taken from his speech. In Morrill's own words, "It was natural that I should look with some favor upon increasing the usefulness of your town library. I have accordingly erected, as I judge, a neat and modest building appropriate to hold your library with any possible future accretions. The library is a privilege of all, the old as well as the young, the poor as much of those who lack nothing. And I have faith that it will have as large, if not a larger, number of patrons than even our school districts. Alas, our library is at present small, but I hope there may be yet some of the generous sons of Stratford who will enlarge it. Still, It contains the life work of many eminent authors, with whom, if they were alive, any of us would be proud to spend the day. Their works still live. Here, without money and without price, you can invite them to your homes, and however you may entertain them, none will find fault with your hospitality. It may be asked, what will the town profit by a library? Ask the little girl with laughing eye who goes trippingly to school and who at home goes through a book with as much relish as she does through a dish of strawberries and cream. Ask her. Ask invalids unable to work and slowly recovering from some acute disease. May they not have the quiet comfort of some fresh book, something to relieve the tedium of passing hours? Ask the boy, taken perhaps by his parents reluctantly from the schoolhouse to the field or the workshop at the age of 15, feeling, as I once felt, as though youthful ambition and hopes had been nipped by an early frost, and who now at least requests a chance to read the life of Franklin, or of Columbus, or of Abraham Lincoln. Ask him. The library and all it contains will be the property of one as much as of another, and that property will yield its profits to all applicants whenever it is practically used. The diffusion of knowledge, of the best thoughts, of the best men, is for the general benefit, like the healthful breeze of the gentle rain for which all are reverently grateful. This gift today is prompted not for the purpose of obtaining the slightest benefit to me, nor the slightest notoriety. It is freely bestowed because I sincerely believe a permanent library will promote, as no other equal expenditure can promote, the highest interests of the inhabitants of this town, uplifting their intelligence, their morals, and their thrift. The building is a respectful offering to my fellow townsmen. Here, my work is ended. Morrill's work promoting libraries and literacy may have ended, but this work has been carried on by many who followed. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from a current advocate of libraries and their importance in society, Julius C. Jefferson. Jefferson has been a lifelong mentor of librarians and a leader in the profession in a variety of roles with a particular commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. During his service as president of the American Library Association, beginning in 2020, he led the association through one of the most challenging periods in its history. As the association's chief spokesperson, Jefferson advocated for COVID relief funding to the libraries and helped libraries adjust to the virtual environment during the pandemic. Jefferson has a long and distinguished record of service in a variety of professional associations. He was president of the Freedom to Read Foundation and the District of Columbia Library Association, as well as on the board of the Black Caucus of the American Library Association and chair of the Intellectual Freedom Committee. Jefferson is currently the chair of the International Federation of Library Associations for the North American Division. Many librarians can attest to the guidance and encouragement he has provided over the years. Especially notable is his contribution as co-editor of the 21st Century Black Librarian in America, Issues and Challenges. In 2022, President Biden appointed Jefferson to the National Museum and Library Services Board. Jefferson currently serves as a section head of the Research and Library Services of the Library of Congress. Please join me in welcoming Julius Jefferson.
Thank you very much, Tracy, for that very generous introduction. I'm going to pull this up for some notes. Stratford, good afternoon. How are you? Can you hear me? I want to make sure you hear me. I only have a little bit of time with you. And the time that I've been in Stratford thus far, since yesterday, it's been an outstanding time. Got an opportunity to meet some wonderful folks here. I will tell you that My journey here was very interesting. And I've been traveling all year long, but this is the first time this year, or of my 55 years, that I've been on a Cessna. So I've never been on a Cessna from Boston to Lebanon. So that was an adventure. And I thought that I was going to be bringing everyone good weather, and I did bring everyone good weather until last night, where unfortunately there was some rain, more rain for you, and so hopefully I will bring you sunshine when I get ready to leave tomorrow. So let me just start off by saying that it's a pleasure to be here with you, and I want to thank the friends of the Morrill Homestead board for inviting me. I also want to just take the time to say that last night I had dinner at Cameron and Gus's home, a wonderful dinner, I should say, and wonderful conversation with members of the board and friends. I have to mention John. Where's John? John is here, right? Where's John? No, that's John. That's John. John the treasurer. John the treasurer. That's John, and of course the board chair, and Ingrid, and David, and of course we had who else was there? Tracy. Will was there, and Martha. Of course, how could I forget Martha? How could I forget Martha? Absolutely. So we had a great time. The person who wasn't there, however, was the person who sort of brought my name up to come visit you, and that's Roger, who's a board member as well. Roger, I hope you were listening. Roger, you missed a great dinner last night, and we wish you could be here. But I certainly do want to thank Roger for connecting me with Tracy and bringing me here. I didn't really know what to expect. I'm going to Vermont. I've never been to Vermont before, but I am glad that I came. Absolutely glad that I came. So I also want to thank Tracy and all of her hard work in getting me here. I know it was difficult. Tracy has been in communication with me since January. And I've been traveling all over, but she's very persistent to make sure we got everything together. And we're here today. And so just thank you so much, Tracy. So we're here today on this occasion. This is the 104th anniversary of Senator Morrill's gift of a library. And I'm just thinking, wow, I mean, who can live and say they gave a town a library? That's like a really big deal, right? And the library building is still standing. And I met the librarian. Where is she? There, I met your town librarian. You're in great hands. You're absolutely great hands. And so when I think about just being able to gift a library, I mean, for me, I think about just the idea to be educated, and the idea to have the right to read and the right to access information. We heard Senator Morrill's his thoughts when he gave the library. So certainly it is about having the opportunity to explore intellectually, to explore your intellectual curiosity. And I believe that Morrill certainly believed that a literate, educated society would lead to prosperity and self-determination for the common person. So it did for him. If it did for him, it could for you and could for anyone else. So just the idea of, I think about it, I don't know what else one could do to uplift the community than to give them a library. And so, especially when we think about the library being a place of lifelong learning. And so, as the examples that Tracy gave, whether you're a small child, or you're someone who's recuperating, or someone whose age is no longer working, your library will serve you, and it will always serve you. Your library is listening to you when you're not there to serve you. And so today, I want to talk a little bit about a story of resiliency in the face of inequity. And we titled this, The Moral Acts in HBCUs, libraries and literacy. When I think about literacy, I'm really thinking about the right to read and access to information. And we want to kind of frame that just within the two Morrill Acts, two very different pieces of legislation during a very difficult time in our a difficult time in our country's history. Next slide. So before that, I mentioned a little bit about this gift. Certainly, we know that Morrill was very influential in sponsoring this landmark legislation in 1862, demonstrating his commitment to education, but of course, he was also demonstrating his commitment to uplifting his own community. I tell people that when we think about a person like Justin Morrill, who spent some years in the House of Representatives, and then he spent years in the Senate, I think that he knew that all politics happens to be local, right? And so that's when you think about this gift. I mean, it was definitely a gift to the people at the local level. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about where I work. I do work at the Library of Congress. I've been there since I was about 16 years of age. I started as a work study student working at the Congressional Research Service, where I currently work now. And I came back. I just, side note, I absolutely thought that I would never, ever work in a library again after high school. I didn't like it. Honestly, I'm like, this work is not for me. So I'm going to do whatever I can do not to work in a library, but it didn't work out that way, unfortunately. And I came back in college and worked in stacks, shelving books. I didn't shelve very many books. I actually read more books than I shelved probably. But I didn't really know this connection of the Library of Congress and Senator Morrill. And so, just reading through his influence on the library being built. And so let me just ask you, how many people have been to the Library of Congress? There we go. All right, a lot of people. We need more people to visit. So, if you've been to the main building, it's now called the Jefferson building. It's called the main building, right? So, they were not honoring presidents in 1897. That came a little later, where they honored Adams and Jefferson and Madison. But when we think about this main building, prior to the main building being built, the Library of Congress was always in the Capitol, somewhere within the Capitol structure. And it was Senator Morrill who said, no, we need to have a separate building on the east front. So everyone knows that the Capitol doesn't have a front or back. It has a west front that faces west and that faces the Washington Monument. And then it has an east front that faces this other pretty important building called the Supreme Court. So, and right next to the Supreme Court is where they decided that there's a whole other story of getting that land together. They decided that's where they were going to put this huge structure, this Italian Renaissance structure. But it really was Morrill, because he definitely believed in buildings and structures, and he believed in libraries. And so he made a speech, he advocated for it, and before we know it, he made a speech in, I believe it was March of 1879. And the speech, again, he advocated to have an independent building. And soon thereafter, he was appointed to serve on the Joint Select Committee for the library. So basically, part of his job on this Joint Select Committee on additional accommodations for the library was to make sure that we saw this through. And it took quite some time to see it through. It was not an easy undertaking, if you can imagine. When we think about this ornate building, it's the first building in DC that had electricity and lights. So it's a pretty impressive building, but it took a lot of advocates. And so I didn't know that Justin Morrill had a major key role in that building, because they needed strong advocates. And so they had these advocates on both sides. So when referring to the newly built main library building in 1897, Joseph G. Cannon, who was the Speaker of the House, there's a building named after Cannon, House Office Building, called it the best public building in Washington, adding, "I am proud of it My constituents are proud of it. It is a great show building. It is our building and worth the money. And Senator Morrill of Vermont echoed candid sentiments asserting that the grandeur and felicitous finish of the main reading room and the Great Hall would be likely to remain unrivaled in this or any other country. So that's pretty impressive. He said that. And so then I'm like, wow, he's talking about the main reading room. So at some point in my career, I was the head of the main reading room. So I was the guy. So if you ever go to the main reading room, you know there's a big circle. So the head of the main reading room, and they call the superintendent of books back in 1897, would sit right at that big oval and overlook everyone who would come into the library. And that was my job. I didn't sit there, however. And so I was very impressed to hear that he made these remarks. So very, very integral figure for libraries for me. Again, so I just wanted to start there. Next slide, please. So I had to frame this for me, like what's the context in talking to you today. So I had to think about Senator Morrill in his life. You know, he lived like almost the entire 19th century, 1810 to 1898. And 44 of those years, he actually lived in DC. You know, spent representing his constituents, representing the state. And so I have to put it in context. You know, so much happened within the 19th century, but he pretty much saw all of it. I mean, almost all of it, and at a high level, either being your representative or representing you at the state level, at the national legislature. And then I thought that, you know, Morrill was 55 when the practice of slavery was ratified by the 13th Amendment on December 6, 1865. So he was 55, he lived 55 years. 55 years he lived. And there was this thing called slavery, right? And so he pretty much saw quite a bit of it in the 19th century. I had to think about that. And then I had to think that certainly those enslaved persons were prohibited by law from reading or being educated. So I had to sort of wrap my head around those three things. So Morrill certainly saw a lot. He saw it at a high level. He saw the majority of the 19th century with so much that happened. And certainly we know that those who were enslaved didn't have access to being educated, right? Next slide, please. So I thought about like wrapping my head around it and putting it in the context of this timeline. So we have July 2nd, 1862, we have the first Morrill Act, and that made it possible for states to establish public colleges funded by, this is the important part, I guess the part that people don't really want to talk about, funded by development or sale of associated federal lands. And 10 million acres provided by these grants were expropriated from tribal lands for Native communities. And that's the really important part for me, right? So you don't think about where all this land came from. So you have already, like I said, you have the people who were enslaved. And then you have people who are going to benefit from expropriation of land. So I have to think about that in this timeline. But then you have on April 6th, and many people are not aware of this, April 6th, 1862, the enslaved persons in DC were emancipated. And so that was the whole experiment. It was leading up to something, this whole experiment, because what had already happened in 1861, the country was at war, right? And so the southern states had seceded from the Union, and the country was at war. But we had this Morrill Act that was passed in 1962. Many of those people weren't in Congress at that time because they had succeeded. And then you have in 1862 as well, April 6th, the DC Emancipation Act. And what made that so interesting is that those persons who had owned enslaved persons were paid for their property. So that was kind of different. And so that was like the incentive in that instance that they were going to get paid for it. So they said, well, I guess we can sort of emancipate them if we can get some money for my property. But then, of course, we continue with the Civil War, and as the Civil War is about to end, we have the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau, better known as the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, was established in 1865. Of course, Congress wanted to help the millions of former or soon-to-be former enslaved persons, as well as poor whites, because people don't really think about the Civil War certainly had an effect on all who were in the states, right? Or the seceding states or soon-to-be states back into the Union. It affected everyone. It didn't just affect those who were formerly enslaved. And one of the things that the Bureau provided was food, housing, medical aid, as well as established schools and offered legal assistance. So we have a lot going on right in these few years. 1865, again, on December 6th, we have the 13th Amendment, which really abolished slavery or involuntary servitude, except for punishment if you commit a crime, right? So don't commit a crime, because then they'll put you somewhere and you won't have any rights, and then you won't be able to vote, right? But it did abolish, certainly abolish what we knew as slavery. So we get all the way down to 1890, and then we have the second Morrill Act. So the first Morrill Act really focused on a certain population that was white, and certainly Morrill was thinking about those who were farmers to make sure they were educated. And then they came back around and said, well, we need to do something for the colored persons as well. So we have the second Morrill Act. And really, when you think about the second Morrill Act, it predates the legal Plessy versus Ferguson case of separate but equal, because they said, well, we're going to have the second act that's going to sort of help colored people. So they're going to be separate. They're going to have their own schools. And many states already had begun to pass laws to have these schools, but now they would benefit from a land grant and from federal funds. And so we have 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson landmark case, and that was separate but equal, and that became the law of the land. But the 1890 land grant act already made it separate but equal in terms of education. And I had to think about that for a second. But really what I want to talk about in this timeline was really important, and many of you probably already knew that little brief, history that I just shared. But you may not have known that in September of 1925, at Hampton University in Hampton, Virginia, a school founded by former General Samuel Armstrong, that a library school opened, awarding the bachelor's degree of library science. The school actually closed in 1939, but the school, when it was founded by funds from the Carnegie Grant, and it graduated over 138 librarians, and 4 of those librarians were career librarians in land grant colleges. 4 were career, 138, 4 worked in land grant colleges their whole entire career. And we had Camille Shriver Shade at Southern University, Margaret Brown at Tennessee State, Ollie Lee Brown at Alabama State, and Thelma Nix at South Carolina State. South Carolina State for you guys, Thelma Nix. All because of a grant from the Carnegie Foundation and a library school at Hampton University. And this was the epitome. Unfortunately, and I'll probably will mention this quite a bit, the library school closed due to funding. And so they were no longer funded, and the library school closed. But the idea of having a library school that would train these librarians to go into communities, public libraries, school libraries, in many instances, especially in the college libraries, it was the first trained librarian at the college and these land grant institutions, was a major breakthrough. And I have to mention that the idea of education for African Americans certainly has been around for many years. Schools like Middlebury, Bowdoin College, Amherst College had admitted African Americans, and they had graduated them. Oberlin certainly being one that graduated quite a few. And then certainly around the end of the Civil War, the churches took over. These missionary societies opened many, many colleges for African Americans. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the states began to fund them, and there were lots of private institutions also. When I talked about the Freedmen's Bureau, I guess I didn't mention, and this is just a shameless plug for me, that it was, Freedmen's Bureau was run by General Oliver Otis. He was from right up the road in Maine. And he was given the task of running the Freedmen's Bureau. And then in 1867, March 3rd, 1867, he was one of the 17 founders of my alma mater, Howard University, named after Oliver Otis Howard. So, so there certainly were a lot of effort to begin to educate, even before the Morrill Act, but certainly the Morrill Act helped in the 1890 version of the act. And so, next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about these land grant institutions, but I'm only going to give you a snapshot. I couldn't talk about all of them. We'd be here for quite some time. There are about 19 of them through the 1890 Land Grant Act. And then they moved the University of the District of Columbia, which has a long history in itself. You know, DC teachers at one time, Federal City College, they merged, a long, long history, Miners Teachers College. They moved that under the 1860 grant, and then the University of Virgin Islands, they moved that under the 1862 act. But there are about 19 land grant, 1890 land grant colleges. And I kind of want to talk about librarians or researchers at 4. So I'm going to highlight just 4 for the sake of this conversation. This is a picture at Southern University. We're going to talk about Southern University in just a second. That's why I have it there. And you see the 1, 2, 3, 4th from the bottom is the Wizard of Tuskegee, Booker T. Washington there. And so Southern University was originally in New Orleans and then moved to Baton Rouge. Booker T. Washington was there to assist. And this picture was taken in, I believe, April of 1950. And it's unique because the wizard passed away in about November of 1950. So he passed away later that year. And I thought it was a great photograph to share. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to talk about Tennessee State. It was Tennessee State Agricultural and Industrial State Normal School for Negroes. And so when we think about these land grant colleges around that time, you know, founded by states in many instances, they were normal schools, which meant they weren't really like colleges, so they were like more like high schools. And so it was founded in 1912. Today it's known as Tennessee State. That was the long version of the name. And I want to talk about Martha Brown because, like, Martha Brown was the first trained librarian. She's from Nashville, Tennessee. She went to Fisk private school. So Fisk, another school founded around 1867. Private school, very elite school. The home of W.B. Du Bois, his alma mater, before he went to Harvard. But so much history at Fisk, that would be for another conversation. But Martha Brown was educated at Hampton University. She educated as a librarian, got her degree in library science there. After Fisk, she went to Hampton and got her degree. And she began working at Tennessee A&I. In 1926, she worked there from 1926 to 1945. So she's one of the 4 that had an entire career at land grant college, entire career. One of the things she did when she got there was that she began planning and advocating for the erection of a library building. So buildings and structures are really important. That's why we're here today, right? Because there's a building and structure that still exists 140 years later that Morrill gifted to the town. And so that was like her biggest legacy. And I'm thinking, wow, I would love to have a legacy to sort of build, like I said earlier, or gift or help fund or build a library. And that's exactly what she did. And so Tennessee A&I became one of the first Black colleges to have a library building. that wasn't necessarily funded by Carnegie, because, you know, Carnegie funded lots of libraries, funded libraries and black colleges as well. But Tennessee and I raised the money, I believe it was somewhere like $100,000 at the time, so lavish, but it was their own building. And the library building was erected. And in 1949, they officially named the building the Martha M. Brown Memorial Library. Now, how cool is that, right? She spent her whole career there, and then they sort of named the library after her. So it's just a testament to her commitment to the students at Tennessee State University, Tennessee A&I back then, to making sure that they had a structure, a building, collections to be able to compete. And certainly, some of you may or may not know that in 1922, Tennessee State was awarded $250 million for the discriminating state funding practices. So that's not just Tennessee State, but a lot of other state schools didn't necessarily get the type of funding that they were supposed to be getting from the state. A colleague of mine, Janet Loring, who writes for Bloomberg, is doing a lot of work and research in this area. Hopefully she's going to have something published to really outline how the discriminating funding practices has affected the education of those who attended historically black colleges and universities. Next slide. So the next person is Camille Shriver Shade, and she was the librarian at that Southern University, initially called Southern University for Colored Students, founded in 1881. Again, it was when it was founded, it was in New Orleans, and then later on, it was moved to Baton Rouge. And she was the university librarian there for 40 years, 1929 to 1969. And she, again, was one of the graduates of Hampton University. So we see that Hampton had a major impact. And she was the first trained librarian herself, which is really important. And her legacy, and because we're talking about literacy, we're talking about the idea of these librarians being culture keepers. Her legacy was she took what was called the Negro collection of books, newspapers, clippings, photographs, biographical information, and artifacts about African Americans. That was called a Negro collection, and she turned it into what is today the Black Heritage Collection, which is housed in a space of 231 square feet, and has more than 11,000 titles, including 1,000 microfilm and microfiche titles, and 193 audiovisual items. And so this is another example of being able to create a space, create access to information about a certain people. So this is a collection about African Americans in a time where certainly it was difficult to be able to find. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but having access to information is so important. And this Black Heritage Collection that she really created meant so much to that community at Southern University of Baton Rouge. Next slide, please. So this individual, Monroe Nathan Work, was not a librarian, but he was a researcher, and a researcher of significant note. He was a bibliographer, he was a historian, he earned degrees, bachelor's and master's degrees from University of Chicago. He was a contemporary of Du Bois, born in 1866. And through his writings, he got the attention of Booker T. Washington. Of course, Booker T. Washington was the wizard around the turn of the century, and Booker T. Washington offered him a position to come to Tuskegee. And so he came to Tuskegee, and he was charged with collecting, recording, and preserving the history of Black life in America. That's a pretty big charge when you think about it. But that was his charge, but he delivered it in a major way. And so one of the things he did in 1912, he began publishing something called the Negro Yearbook. And so this is the type of material that would have been in that heritage collection, the Negro collection itself. Just a little sunlight. Someone is talking to me, so I'm gonna keep going. So we would find this type of information in that Negro collection at Southern University and other collections similar to it. And the Negro Yearbook was a compilation of information and statistics on Black life in America, economically, socially, and historically. But of particular note, he continued making sure that he documented lynchings in the United States. So he got there around 1900, and he documented some lynchings. Of course, there was a resurgence in lynchings, a resurgence in the organization that was formed in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866 called the Ku Klux Klan. And so he began to document that right there in Tuskegee. And certainly there was a lot of that down in the South. And then in 28, he published a scholarly research on called The Bibliography of the Negro in Africa and America. And it contained over 17,000 entries, including many, many rare items that he was able to obtain from libraries across the world, including Europe. So he later published a Negro Yearbook and Bibliography. So, I mean, he created a lot of access to information about African American people right there at Tuskegee. He spent something like 33 years of his life in Tuskegee doing this work. So again, another example of providing access. And I often say that these individuals are culture keepers. And this is another example of a culture keeper at Tuskegee. Next slide. Okay. So I want to end talking about an individual who actually did meet at the end of his life, E.J. Joseph. And in modern library circles, he's a stalwart individual, an individual who we all kind of look up to through his career. So, and he, this is another shameless plug, I'm sorry, he is a graduate of Howard University as well. But he obtained master's degrees from Columbia University in history, as well as a master's in library science from the University of Albany. But he began his career at the Free Library of Philadelphia. Didn't work out for him, stayed there a year, and then he was recruited to work at Delaware State as a director of libraries. So Delaware State, when Delaware State was founded by the state, it was called Delaware College for Colored Students, and it was founded in 1891. And so E.J. Josey went there in 1955. He didn't stay there very long. He stayed there about 4 years, but he was able to help Del State with his accreditation. And this is the type of thing that he talked about throughout his career, accreditation in libraries. So that was his primary focus. But he also began the library culture program featuring guest artists and poets. So again, sort of keeping the culture within a library. And so later on, E.J. went on to work at Savannah State. While he was at Delaware State, he began writing, he began thinking about library management, and began thinking about equity and diversity. And so this is long before we had EDI task force or DEI task force. E.J. was writing about it, he was thinking about it. And he began to become very active within the American Library Association. I can tell you that one of the reasons why I got active in the American Library Association was because of E.J. Joseph and his work. I mean, he left so much for me to read about. I read everything he wrote, and I think I became very intrigued. And one of the things he did when he was at Savannah State was at that time, many of the state library associations were still segregated. So they didn't allow anyone who wasn't white to be a member. And E.J. had become a leader in the American Library Association. He had become a member of the policymaking body. And so he wrote a resolution. And in that resolution, he said that the staff of the American Library Association should not have anything to do with this state library until the state library begins to admit everyone. And so that resolution passed, and E.J. Joseph became the first Black member of the Georgia Library Association. So, I mean, right at the top, this is the person that, I think, and he had a very, very long career that people began to look at. He was very active within the association. He went on to work at the State Education Department, the Library Division for New York, like the State Library for New York. But he also went on to chair many committees at the American Library Association. He was the second African-American president of the American Library Association. The first was 100 years after ALA was founded. ALA was founded in 1876, which is an interesting year too, 1876. So that was kind of like the year before the end of Reconstruction. But then in 1976, Clara Stanton Jones became the first African-American to be president, and E.J. Josie became president a few years after that. And so certainly that was one of the reasons why I felt like I wanted to be ALA president, because of what E.J. Josie had did. So he is absolutely known as the father of Black activist librarianship, and someone that we all. I want to end with him, his career, because I think there's just so much that he wrote about librarianship that you can read, and he influenced so many librarians. Certainly, in thinking about equity within libraries, thinking about equity of access to all. And next slide. So this I wanted to kind of end with this book because it's kind of important to me. I'm going to kind of change it a little bit. So this is a Frederick Douglass quote. And Douglass said, knowledge makes, I'm going to say, a person unfit to be a slave. I say enslaved. And it's kind of important when we think, so I talk about all these things and think about like, where are we now? What's next? When we think about this anniversary, 140 years of Justin Morrill giving the library to his town. And I think about so much that we hear in the news about access to information being banned, books being banned. What's next? And what's next for you? You know, what's your role in all this? Certainly, all of you have a role to support your town library, which you do. But I think we all have a role to make sure that access to information, access to education, the right to read is practiced for everyone. We all have that individual role because the idea to have access to information is not just a right, it's a human right, a right that every one of us should have. And so, as I end this, I just want us to think about what role we're going to play to make sure that everyone has access to information throughout their life, whether it's inside their school library, inside their public library, inside their college or university library. If we all have access to information, we all have access to get an education. So I'm going to stop there and see if we have any questions. I would say thank you to Ben for taking care of the technology and Paul for taking care of the technology and the slides. I really appreciate it so much. So Tracy, any questions in chat? Did I put everyone to sleep?
No, not yet.
Okay. Oh, we have a question. Yes.
From the title of your presentation, I didn't quite catch what HCBU is.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you very much. So historically Black colleges and universities, and they're better known as HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. I should have written it out. Right? Yes.
I don't know if you're familiar, but we had a sort of a big sentence here in Vermont where 3 small schools are getting together to merge, and there was a move afoot to close the libraries on the feeling that you didn't need to have a place where all these books, and it would just be a waste of space, and they could get all the information they needed offline. What's your thought?
These were state universities that were saying.
Yeah. So, library is not just about books, it's about space as well. And certainly in the academic setting, there's lots of literature we talk about library as space. So when we think about how we educate. Unless we're going to educate in isolation, we certainly educate with the transferring of knowledge and information with each other. And in many academic institutions, they're creating spaces where students want to have more interaction with each other inside the walls of the library. So it's not just a quiet place. Certainly, technology allows those to have access to information, but there's a lot of information that you're not going to be able to get through technology. And certainly when you think about special collections, a lot of that information is going to be inside in archives, inside the library. So I absolutely believe we need a building, we need space, and the space absolutely needs to fit the community, serve that specific community. So it's not, I don't think that there's one way we should use space in the library. It depends on the community. But I'm sorry to hear that. I hope they reconsider it. Maybe. Oh, good. Oh, okay. I would have been one of the ones advocating to certainly have the space. And then, I would be one to bring in the students and ask the students, what kind of space do you need to be productive? But you see more and more collaborative spaces in libraries now, in university libraries, right? So the idea that there's Starbucks in a library is not just for Starbucks to make money, but it's because they know students are going to be there, they're going to collaborate, and it's to help foster this collaboration. So, yeah, that's not the, yes, Tracy.
Yes, somebody is asking, to support libraries, what is the most important form of engagement individuals can do in this moment?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. One, to support libraries, you should use your library, engage with your library. I hope that when you think supporting a library, it doesn't mean that you sit at home and talk about it, but we need you to take action. So we need you to use your public library. We need you to understand how your public library works. We need you to be engaged. We need you to have conversations with your librarians, making sure that your librarians have what you need. But at the same time, because libraries, especially public libraries, are funded either by local government, state, federal government, we need you to be an advocate at whatever level that particular library is. We need you to advocate, we need you to vote, we need you to make sure that the library gets funding. But, I always say, and when I was ALA president, we were going through the pandemic, we advocated for the federal government to give funds to help libraries as we were going through COVID. And that money was administered through the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And they were looking at the underrepresented libraries and how they were affected. They were looking at rural libraries and tribal libraries. But I often thought that, for me, and for others, do we really know the needs of those libraries? Are we really that engaged? So I say engagement first, to understand how it works. And then I say, certainly advocate for the funding, get involved at the local, state, and national level, and vote, participate. Let's go here and then here.
What do you think AI is going to do with the role of the librarian?
Oh my God. Oh my God. So I guess this is one of those moments, right? Okay, so the question is the role of AI and how that's going to affect librarians. Is that right? Yes. So I guess I should have expected that question, because this is a question that comes up. So I'm like, AI again. But, we talk about AI quite a bit. Within the library, there's something called Chat GPS, GPT, thank you, Chat GPT. So I've done these little experiments. We've done experiments with some of my friends in academia when it comes to helping them build a syllabus. What can AI do to help build a syllabus? And so I think it's like any other tool. AI is not going to go away, but we have to learn how to use it. It's sort of like, when the internet came about, and still it's about literacy on how to use the internet, right? Because, librarians are there to kind of let you know what information is accurate and how can you choose accurate sources of information. So I think that we're gonna have to get to a point where we kind of understand how we can best use AI. I don't think AI is gonna take the role of a live human being. But we certainly should be looking at it. At work, we were talking about this. This is like a topic at work, at the National Library, AI. And so, I don't think librarians are going to say AI is great and we don't have a job. I don't think that's the case. But I think that we're going to have to see how we can use AI to benefit our users. And that's what librarians do. Librarians solve information needs. And so how can AI be used to solve the needs of our user? I think that's where we're going to go. It's going to take a lot of conversation, I think, and a lot of experimentation to try to find the right balance. But librarians aren't going anywhere. Yes, sir.
In what ways did the role of the libraries at the historically Black colleges and universities differ from the roles of libraries in other academic institutions?
Yeah, what ways did the role of the libraries at HBCUs differ from roles of the libraries in mainstream universities? So the roles are always going to be the same. The difference is funding. Yeah. And so I read an article that was written like in 1970. It doesn't seem like a long time ago, but 1970 is like 53 years ago. And they were talking about HBCU libraries. And the issue with HBCU libraries, historically Black college libraries, in 1970 was the issue of funding. Now, the issue with most libraries is funding, all across the board, but even more so with HBCU libraries, as evidenced by the fact that that case that I mentioned earlier about Tennessee State, being awarded $250 million because they were underfunded for so many years. So libraries are already underfunded, and then these HBCU libraries are even more underfunded, and that has a role on whether or not you can hire librarians, whether or not you can build collections, whether or not you can build facilities. It plays a vital role. You go to some libraries and say, "Wow, this is beautiful," and then you will go to an HBCU library, whether it's the library or the other facilities, and you're like, "Wow, doesn't look as nice as the one over here." So, but as far as the roles, in terms of the profession, I mean, librarians are committed to serving the needs of the academic community, serving the needs of the students and the faculty. So I don't think that changed. I certainly would focus on the funding. Yes, ma'am. You had a question? Yes, ma'am.
I'm gonna thank my colleague here for mentioning the problem with the beginning of Vermont State University with this trying to abolish the libraries. I think your concept of culture keeper is really a wonderful one, and that we didn't use that terminology in trying to defend the libraries, but the outcry actually led the person in charge to resign, which was a step forward. I'm not sure the libraries are totally protected yet, but it was also a kind of an issue. My question to you has to do with HBCUs today. I understand that the Biden administration has promised some funding for HBCUs. I may be wrong about that. And there was a lot of talk about them in the wake of the Supreme Court decision to abolish affirmative action. Because some people say, well, the HBCUs will get more enrollment and resources. But then my other question is, Harvard University has announced an outreach program to HBCUs with Ruth Simmons as the person in charge. And I'm wondering if you don't have any details about that.
I don't have any details about that. I can say that in terms of funding, there have been lots of private funders that I'm aware of that have funded HBCU libraries. So we have the funding coming from ex-wife Bezos, who's given a lot of money to HBCU libraries. And I know that when the Supreme Court decision came down, you heard people, even the president of Harvard University, say this is going to be a strain on HBCUs. I kind of felt like it was an opportunity for HBCUs. So I just talked about resiliency, right? And so I'm thinking, well, wow, that's a different concept now. So now you're going to say it's a strain. But that's not the history of the historically Black colleges and universities. It's one of resilience. It's one of we didn't have the funding, but we still did this. we still serve the population. But I understood what he was saying, and I didn't necessarily agree with it, but I understood the concept. The concept is that now you're gonna have, more enrollment at this university. We're not gonna be able to handle it. We can barely handle our enrollment down. But what it does mean is, as I guess as a college president, what's the job of a college president? To raise money, to find money, right? That's one of the roles of a college president. That maybe, some of the college presidents have to work harder to get more money to be able to support. It's just going to be an influx. Remember, we just talked about for a long time, it was separate, not equal. Separate, not equal. So, African Americans didn't have much of a choice but to go to these schools. And I gave examples of how there were still people who went above and beyond service at these institutions and within the library. So I hope that if there are more enrollments, and the other piece of that is that there are a lot of historically Black colleges and universities, there are 117 of them. So maybe everyone is not going to go to the few that we know about. And you say, well, we know about Howard University, we know about Morehouse and Spelman, and we know about Fisk, but there are a whole bunch of other colleges out there that are available for people to go to. So maybe that means the enrollment may be higher at some of the other schools, hopefully. But I think it is worth a conversation. We should still continue to talk about it. Yes, Tracy.
I have a question here. What programs of the federal government, especially the Library of Congress, support public libraries across the country?
Is that Roger Wall?
Yes.
That question?
Yeah.
Roger Wall. I mean, really, Roger? Really, Roger? I mean, can the Library of Congress support? The Library of Congress is funded by Congress, Roger. You know that. it's like, what can the library? So I'm not aware of the Library of Congress having any role in that. The Library of Congress certainly takes a direction from the 100 members of the Senate who provide appropriations, as well as the 435 voting members of the House of Representatives. And I'm not aware of them telling the Library of Congress to take on that role. I am not aware of it. But I can say this, that I think that there are individuals at the Library of Congress who are active in associations who support HBCU libraries. I'm one of them. I'm not the only one. And I think that we see a lot of this work, a lot of this advocacy work through other organizations. But in terms of direct funding from the library, I'm not aware of that, of the library granting any funds for that. So I'll look into it, Roger, and I will get back to you. Yes, sir. In the back and then yes.
Talk about what institutions are using the libraries in the future. More specifically, I'm curious about the present role of historically Black colleges and universities in doing training of librarians. Is training of future librarians a core part of the academic program in many historically Black colleges and universities?
Actually, that's a good question. The training of it. So, yeah, that's a very good question. I talked about Hampton University and their library school training in 1925. And then in the 50s, you had Atlanta University. They had a library school. And that closed in like 2004 or 5. And there's only one historically Black college and university that has a library school, that's North Carolina Central. So, and I brought that same question up. I brought it up in my alma mater. I'm like, we should have a library school, And the issue is that the F word, funding, right? Will it be? Is it sustainable? Will we have the enrollment? Will it be able to pay for itself? I think we should try harder because again, there's only one HBCU library school in the country. And so a lot of what we see for training does come from the associations. The American Library Association has something called the Spectrum Scholarship to train a diverse population of librarians. So that's librarians of color. And they have raised a significant amount of money to help fund library school. It's been around for 25 years. One of the founding individuals was a past ALA president named Betty Churach. Dr. Carla Hayden was involved early on in the spectrum, and many others along the way. So the funding is not the only thing that the spectrum does. They also provide a cohort and training outside of the formal training in library school. And it's produced quite a bit of librarians who are active and engaged within the profession. So yeah, funding is always an issue, certainly. But I do like your question about, what some of the college presidents are doing. I hope there's some historically Black college president that's thinking about a library school, because I can tell you from what I understand, I'm not so sure how long we will have the North Carolina Central program. And so if we lose that program, we won't have any. So thanks for that question. Gus?
Can I ask you about your current position?
Yeah, my current position. Currently, I'm in Stratford, talking to you folks, and I'm loving it. But what's tomorrow? Monday, I'll be heading back to the Library of Congress, where I work at the Congressional Research Service. I lead research librarians in the area of foreign affairs, defense, and trade. These librarians cover the gamut. All of the defense issues, defense budget, defense policy, foreign policy, and all the areas, Asia, Middle East, and Africa, and Europe and the Americas. And we provide information analysis to members of Congress and their staff. And we write reports, we write memos, and we respond to congressional requests. So it's pretty demanding. Right now, it's supposed to be a little slow because our Congress is on recess. But as I read the emails and I'm away, we're still getting lots of requests. But that's what I do in the daytime.
What about, you told me about the sustainable development goals.
Yeah. Yes. So I am involved in the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, called IFLA. And and that's the place for global librarianship. All the institutions around the world, all the library associations around the world form this federation globally. And one of the things that we're doing, I'm chair of the North American Regional Division, is that we are advocating for the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 at the UN. So just when I was ALA president a few years ago, I was at a meeting, joint meeting with some Russian librarians, some Russian colleagues. And, they gave their presentation and they talked about all the things they were doing with these Sustainable Development Goals for the UN. And when it came time for us to talk, we didn't really have anything to talk about. So I was a bit, the Russians kind of embarrassed us, but the Russian librarians are great colleagues. So they kind of, lit a match under us to become involved. And so within ALA, what we did was we put together a task force. We started getting people involved, engaged, making them aware of the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them, and talk all about the environment, how we live globally. And so what we do within IFLA is they have something called the high-level forum. High-level forum on SDGs. I was just there in July, where we hear from all of the delegates from around the world and what they're doing about sustainable development. We focus on Goal 11 in July. Goal 11 looks at towns. And so I'm glad you brought that up because Martha and I were on a ride, we went past Elizabeth Mine today, and I look and I see panels, solar panels. I mean, that's sustainable development. And of course, guess you have a panel in your backyard. That's sustainable development. And so I guess I shouldn't tell everybody that you have that. I'm sorry. But that's I see a lot of panels in this town. And that's one of the things we're talking about, sustainable development at the local level. What we're doing at the local level, because that's where it all starts. Making sure that we don't have floods. What are we doing, for the water and the resources? I mean, these are all things that are wrapped up into these 17 goals. And so I do a little work there through that. So thanks for asking that question. Yes, sir.
What organizations would you mention for supporting fighting the banning laws?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Good question. So I was president of an organization. I was president for 4 years, president for 3 years, on the board for 4, to the Freedom to Read Foundation. So the Freedom to Read Foundation has been around since 1969. It is affiliated with the American Library Association, and it supports the right to read for all individuals. Adjacent to that is something called the Merit Fund, which supports those individuals who have been affected by providing access. So librarians who are being criminalized for providing access to their job, they can get support from the Merit Fund. So we have the Freedom to Read Foundation and the Merit Fund. And so I also will say that not being a member of the American Library Association is not just for librarians, because it's the American Library Association, not the American Librarian Association. So it's for individuals who certainly want to support libraries. So you can also become a member of the American Library Association. All right, yes, this is the last one. How much time do we have? Oh, we have all day. Do I get dinner?
First of all, thank you for joining us and for this fascinating talk. I was interested in the 4 librarians you particularly highlighted during your talk. And I'm sure each of them has a vivid history of their own. But I was interested in the 3rd one you mentioned, at Tuskegee.
Yes.
Whose name, I'm sorry,
Thank you, work.
my mind.
Yes.
And that he was particularly interested in collecting data and publicizing about lynching.
Yes.
All the time. And I was wondering what kind of reception his work had, or effect his work had in publicizing those issues that were central to the experience of many Black communities, but was being, as we would say today, the rest of society was in denial and not accepting that. And I wondered if you had anything to say about their role in trying to inform the larger public of these issues.
You know, that's a good question. So thank you for that question and listening, because you were listening to that, so I appreciate that. But no, you know, not much has changed in America. So prior to work compiling this information, a woman by the name of Ida B. Wells did the same thing. She compiled information. I mean, her life was always in jeopardy for doing that. Right? And I would think that, you know, Work's life was in jeopardy being in Alabama for doing this work as well. I understand that, you know, whether it's in the early 20th century or the early 21st century, that there's some information that people just don't want to be free. And I suspect that was exactly the case what you just said. It wasn't very popular at the time. But, you know, we do things that aren't popular because they need to be done. I mean, it's about you know, telling the truth and providing access to the truth. And these were, I mean, to this very day, people still don't know that it was, you know, an epidemic. Black people were getting lynched. There's a whole museum about it in Montgomery, Alabama. I mean, Black people were getting lynched, and you know, no one was being held responsible for these lynchings. You know, we know of major cases like Emmett Till in the 50s, but this went all over the South. And so, you know, I can only imagine how difficult it was getting this information. But part of the reason that Booker T. Washington worked there was to do this work. He brought him there and gave him a charge. You know, I think like 1900, he said, you want to do this work. And this is the work that, you know, frankly, Booker T. Washington couldn't do. So he couldn't do this work. Booker T. Washington was a very political individual. He certainly, you know, made sure that he walked that line. But he hired someone else to put this information together, and I give him credit for that. So I imagine that it was just as difficult then as it is today to have conversations and share this information. I don't see much has changed, but thanks for that question. All right, last question.
Couple of things.
Oh, and we have two things, okay.
If you've had a good time here, coming way into the capillaries of the American organism, you can come back by train. You don't need a book. They'll give you enough time to write a book, read a book each way.
I can read Gus's memoir on the train.
Made some references to your alma mater. There's a very good fellow in our community named Joe Major who's made a wonderful impact for the last 5 or 6 years. And I said, Joe, where did you go to school? He said, well, he said, it starts with an H and ends with a D, and it's not Harvard. So you don't need to.
I like that. Thank you very much. And I will say that I would love to come back when I could take a train and relax. We catch the airplane. Sometimes you have to catch a train because the airplanes are delayed all the time. Right?
Every day.
It's delayed. So sometimes it's like you might as well just get on the train because the airline tells you that, oh, your plane is delayed till tomorrow, right? So sometimes it's best. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. And thank you all for your questions and for listening.